We've been following the approval rating of Donald Trump for some time. It's relevant for a number of reasons, which I've told you about and will tell you about again. And we've seen Trump's approval rating sporadically in the low 30s in a variety of different polls, but not in the Gallup daily presidential approval tracking poll. That's sort of the gold standard for comparison for presidential approval. Gallup's daily tracking poll has been around for decades, and Trump's previous low in that poll was 35%. And as you'll see here, if you're watching with us on this graph that we put up on the screen, on 3 days, 3 different days during August 13th, 23rd, and 24th, Donald Trump's approval rating hit yet another presidency low of 34%. Now, as of this morning, it was back to 35%. But what I want to call your attention to in this graph is that if we analyze this graph like we might analyze a stock price of a company that's publicly traded, we'd see that despite the fact that the low hasn't dropped that much, the presidency low had been 36% for a while, and then we saw 35%, and then now we saw 34%. You can look at the trend line and see that the general trend is going lower and lower. Trump's high points are lower and lower, and we're picking up lower and lower low points as well. Now, there's some other internals from Trump's approval that I want to briefly mention. 16% of Americans like Donald Trump's conduct as president of the United States. That's according to a Pew Research poll. That's a separate question from approval. You can dislike Trump's conduct, but still approve of the job that he's doing. Requires a little bit of cognitive dissonance, but there's plenty of that to go around among Trump supporters. And also from the Gallup daily tracking poll internals, with young people, meaning 18 to 29-year-olds, 20% approval, 20% approval. 80% of individuals aged 18 to 29 either disapprove of the job Trump is doing or aren't sure. This is indicative of trouble for 2020, because you are going to have more voters who will have turned 18 between last election day and the next one, and they presumably are not going to be friendly to Donald Trump. However, I want to be very upfront and clear about something with you. Despite Donald Trump's unpopularity, even at 34 or 35%, he could still win re-election in 2020. And the math is actually it's almost so simple that many people are missing it. There's an article in The Week from Damon Linker, and it points out pretty astutely, pretty obviously as well, that just because you don't approve of Donald Trump doesn't mean that, number one, you'll vote at all. Number one, you might just not vote. Even though you disapprove of the job Trump is doing, you might not vote because you don't think your vote makes a difference, or just you don't really vote. And number two, it doesn't mean that you would necessarily vote for someone else. You could be a Republican who disapproves of the job that Donald Trump is doing, but you're not going to vote for whoever the next Hillary Clinton is, or Bernie Sanders, or whoever it is that ultimately runs in 2020. And this comes down to election polls versus approval polls. For election prediction polls, and we've talked about this, you need a likely voter model, because if you're trying to predict an election, we don't have mandatory voting in the US. You need to assess who is going to vote, and only among those people, who are they likely to vote for. Approval polls are just, do you approve of the job Trump is doing as president, regardless of whether you did vote or plan to vote. And that's where we get to the simple math of it. Trump won the 2016 election with 46.4% of the popular vote. He lost the popular vote, eked out small wins in 3 key states, and ultimately defeated Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College. Voter turnout was about 50%. This means that Trump only needed roughly 25% of the vote of all eligible American voters, because turnout was so low. This means that if 34% of the country approves of Donald Trump, you can still win, because Trump won with only 25% of the eligible vote.
It seems like if he's done it once, he can do it again.
Absolutely.
And Michael Moore, who's one of the few progressive voices who predicted that Donald Trump was going to win the 2016 election, now predicts that he's going to win re-election. Maybe he'll lose by even more in the popular vote, but he still could hold on to those states of like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, because his message is resonating there. And that's why we have to either try to push for eliminating the Electoral College or just pushing for something easier, which is a national interstate popular vote compact.
We've talked about that. That would be where if enough states whose total electoral vote count comprises 270, they can pledge to put their electoral votes towards the winner of the popular vote nationally, and that is de facto eliminating the electoral vote, but we will dig into that more on a future program. The video you just watched was made possible by support from you. Please go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show. You can make a pledge of as little as $1 per month, and every dollar helps to support the work that we're doing, particularly in light of the YouTube ad boycott, which has been really bad.